The bishop's buggy turned up our lane on a September evening, just as the light was going soft and gold over the cornfields, and I watched it come from the kitchen window with a dish towel still in my hands. My mother saw it too, and she crossed the room and set her hand on my shoulder and pressed me down into the good chair by the table, the one nobody sat in on ordinary days, and she smoothed my cap and told me to fold my hands and keep them folded. I was 18 years old, and my wedding was one season away, and in our district, a marriage is not announced until the bishop has seen the bride, and I was 18 years old the evening he came to see me. I did not know yet what he had come to see. I only knew that the lamp had been lit early, that my father had washed his hands and combed his beard, and that nobody had told me what I was meant to do except sit still and be looked at. I should tell you how it came to be that a man I had spoken to perhaps 4 times was going to be my husband. Aaron was a widower from the next district over, a good man by every account, 32 years old with a farm that had gone quiet after his first wife passed in the spring, and he needed a wife before winter the way a farm needs a roof before snow. His people spoke to my people, the way these things are done among us, and on a Sunday after G-May, after the preaching was finished and the benches cleared and the tables set up in the same room, our 2 families ate together at our place, and I served. I carried the bread and the stew and the pies from the kitchen to the table, and the men talked about the hay, and about Aaron's farm, and about the district line, and I understood, the way you understand weather coming, that they were also talking about me. Nothing was said to me at that table. It was later, in the kitchen, that my mother told me it was settled, that Aaron's family was pleased, that the bishop would come in September to give the match his approval, and that I should thank God for a good prospect. I said that I would. I remember standing at the dry sink with my hands in the cooling dishwater, feeling that something had been decided in a room I had been standing in the whole time, and that the deciding had happened around me the way furniture gets moved. I did not have a word for it yet. Nobody had asked me whether I wished to marry Aaron, and the strangest part is that I did not expect them to, because the question simply did not exist in our house, and I did not know yet that a question could be missing. The week before the bishop came, my mother scrubbed that house the way she scrubbed for communion, and in the same motion she scrubbed me. We went over my answers while we worked, the 2 of us on our knees on the kitchen floor, and she taught me what the bishop might ask and what I was to say, which was mostly yes and no and scripture, and above all to keep my eyes down. My hands had to be clean and unpicked, with nothing bitten and nothing rough, because a girl's hands tell a house what kind of wife she will be, and I was to wear my plainest dress, my oldest good one, nothing that would make a man think I thought myself something. Do not laugh, she said, because a laughing girl looks light. Do not speak first, because a speaking girl looks forward. Do not let your eyes wander around the room like a child's. She chose my plainest dress and made me practice sitting, truly practice it, lowering myself into the good chair with my hands folded and my eyes on the tabletop until I could do it without being told. My father said little that week, but on the morning of the day he looked at me a long moment at breakfast and nodded once, the way he nodded at a field that had come in well, and I understood I was the field. At the wash line that week, the other girls traded their inspection stories the way we traded weather, because nearly every married woman on that line had sat in the same chair I was about to sit in. Katie said her bishop had asked her to recite from the catechism until she cried, and that the crying had been counted against her. Mary said hers had looked through her sewing basket piece by piece and held her hem-stitching up to the lamp, and had asked her mother whether the girl was strong enough for butchering season. They laughed about it, the way you laugh about a storm once the roof has held, but nobody called it strange. It was simply the thing that happened the autumn before a wedding, like canning, like the school term ending at 8th grade, like everything else in our lives that had always been done, and so was never questioned, and I folded the sheets and listened and told myself it was only one evening. He came at 6, and he sat at our table with my father on one side of him and my mother at the far end, and I sat in the good chair with my hands folded, exactly as I had been placed. My mother brought coffee and a plate of molasses cookies I had baked that morning, and the bishop took one and said it was well made, and I understood the cookie had also been an answer. He asked me my age and my schooling and whether I had been baptized, and then he asked me from the catechism, questions I had known since I was 12, and I answered with my eyes on the tabletop the way I had practiced all week. He asked whether I could keep a garden, whether I had helped with butchering, whether I knew how to stretch a winter on what the cellar held, and my mother answered some of it for me, quickly, the way you answer for a good horse you are selling. He asked about the canning, and she rose and walked him to the shelf in the cellar doorway, where the jars stood in their rows, peaches and beans and tomatoes, and he looked at them the way you look at a ledger. And here I will stop a moment, because if you have sat with me this far into my story, if you have ever sat quiet in a chair while other people decided your life, I would be glad if you would subscribe to this channel so you do not miss what my gross mommy asked me the next morning, and gladder still to read in the comments whether you have ever been weighed by hands that meant you no harm. I read everyone. Then he asked for the sewing basket, and it was brought down, and he turned my work over in his hands, my mending, my hem-stitching, the quilt square I had pieced that summer, and he held the small stitches up toward the lamp and squinted at them. And then he asked to see my hands, and I held them out, and he turned them palm up in the lamplight and looked at them, a long, quiet look, at the calluses and the clean nails, and then he looked over the top of my head at my father, and the two men held that look the way men do over livestock at an auction, and he nodded, and it was done. The whole of it took perhaps 40 minutes, and no voice was ever raised, and no one was unkind, and still I went to bed feeling like something had been taken out of me and counted. The buggy rolled back down the lane and the evening closed over it, and my mother wept a little with relief, and my father said it was a good night, and the wedding could be spoken of now, and I should have felt only gladness, because nothing had gone wrong. But something in me would not settle. I helped my mother wash the coffee cups and put the good chair back against the wall, and the house felt the way a room feels after visitors, tidier than it really is. I lay awake that night and held my own hands up in the dark, palm up, the way he had held them, and I could not name what was wrong with me, because he had been kind and quiet, and nothing unseemly had happened in that room, and still I felt like a jar that had been checked for cracks and set back on the shelf with the others. I turned it over until the rooster started, and by first light I had decided I was being foolish, and by breakfast I had decided it again, and it would not stay decided. So after the morning chores, I walked the back lane to my grossmommy's dotty house with a basket of bread on my arm as an excuse, half ashamed of what I was carrying inside me, rehearsing how I would make it sound small. My grossmommy was the one woman in the district who had never been inspected, because she had married my gross dotty in the old country before she ever came to this district, before the bishops here held this custom, and she had watched 3 generations of us go through it with her lips pressed together. She was 81 that autumn, small as a bird, and her little house smelled of dried apples and wood smoke. I expected her to tell me to be grateful. I had come, if I am honest, to be told to be grateful, to have the feeling scolded out of me by someone old enough to know better than to indulge a girl's foolishness. She set me down at her little table and poured the coffee and let me talk, and I told her the whole evening, the catechism, the canning shelf, the sewing basket, my hands in the lamplight, the look, the nod, and she listened all the way through without once interrupting, the way the old ones do, her eyes on my face the whole time. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she reached across the table and took my hand, and she said, "Kind, I will ask you one thing, and you answer me honest." And in all that evening, child, did one person in that room ask what you wished? I sat there, and I could not answer, because the answer was no, and we both knew it, and she nodded as if I had said it aloud. She said, "Levi, listen to me now. The Ordnung is not written down, you know this, and what is not written can be made into whatever a man needs it to be. That evening was never about your faith, she said, and it was never about your soul, because your soul cannot be seen in a jar of peaches or the palm of a hand. It was a man making sure the goods were sound before he let the district bless the trade, and the church's blessing is folded around it, so a girl does not notice what is happening to her. So she kneels and thanks God for being weighed. She said she had watched it all her life in this country, this custom dressed in the church's clothes, and that it was not God, and it was not the faith. It was only a way men had found to make certain, and that the cruelest part was not the looking, it was what the looking taught. It taught every bride to walk into her marriage already weighed, already priced, already knowing that her worth had been decided across a table by men who never once thought to ask her anything but Scripture. She told me she had watched her own daughters sit in that chair, and her daughters' daughters, and that she had never spoken against it, because a widow alone at the edge of a farm does not get to speak against the bishop, and she asked my forgiveness for that, an 81-year-old woman asking mine. She said, "In the old country your Grostadi asked me himself, in a field, with no one watching, and he waited for my answer like a man waiting for rain, and that is the only way it was ever meant to happen." I sat there with my coffee going cold, and something in my chest coming loose, not breaking, coming loose, like a knot worked free. "I have a word for it now," she said to me, "but you will have to find your own. Nothing stopped the wedding, and I want to be honest about that, because this is not a story where the girl runs. I married Aaron that November in our front room, with the benches full and the roast chicken after, and he was not a cruel man, and I will not make him into one for the sake of a story. He worked hard, and he was gentle with the animals, and in time we made a life that had real goodness in it, and I loved him in the way that grows when two people carry the same winters. But something in me had turned over at my grossmommy's table, and it never turned back. From that November on, I never again let anyone turn my hands palm up, not a bishop, not a husband, not any man who believed my worth was his to verify. When my hands were wanted, I offered them or I did not, and I learned the difference between being looked at and being seen, and I taught my children that difference before I taught them their letters. And years later, when my own daughter was 18 and the bishop's buggy turned up our lane on an October evening, I did not stand in the doorway the way my mother had, smoothing a cap and teaching stillness. I went and I sat down in the chair beside my girl, close enough that our sleeves touched, and I stayed there the whole evening, in the lamplight, while the questions were asked and the basket was turned over and the jars were counted. Nobody had ever sat beside me. It is a small thing, a woman in a chair where a woman had not sat before. But small things are how customs end, and my daughter did not go into her marriage weighed, and when the bishop looked at me over her head, I looked back, and I did not look down first. If you are a wife or a mother listening to this, I want you to hear me gently, because I am not angry anymore, and anger was never the point. A girl is not goods. Her worth was never meant to be decided across a table, in lamplight, by men checking her hands and her jars and her hems, while she keeps her eyes down and calls it faith. And I want you to know that I do not hate the men who weighed us, because they were taught to, every one of them, taught by fathers who were taught by fathers, and nobody ever asked them what it cost the girl in the chair, and nobody ever asked them what it cost them either, to sit in judgment over someone they were meant to love. The bishop who turned my hands to the lamplight was not a wicked man. He was a man performing a custom he had inherited, and that is almost sadder, because inherited harm asks no one's permission to keep going, and it wears the face of ordinary life so well that you can sit inside it for years before you feel its shape. If you have a daughter, sit beside her. If you were the girl in the chair once, forgive yourself for thanking them after, because you were taught to thank them. And teaching is not the same as truth. What I know now, what my grossmommy gave me at her little table with the coffee going cold, is that a custom is only a thing people do, and things people do can be done differently. One kitchen, one mother, one chair pulled close at a time. All those years I had no name for what happened to me that September evening. I have a word for it now. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. I wrote the whole story down in my book, the parts I could say out loud and the parts I could only write. There is a link in the description and a pinned comment below. Until next time, hold your girls close and ask them what they wish.